got anybody here to fix this wreck, mister?
Roll her in.
10 more you don't make it. That, 5 more you don't. That, not you.
Shoot.
How long will it take, Pop?
Can't tell till we look her over. Come back tomorrow.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today I'm joined by Chris Nicholson, who is the founder and CEO of Pathmind, which is an AI startup that applies deep reinforcement learning to supply chain and industrial operations. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Scott. Happy to be here.
All right. So for many years, I think over a decade or so, you were actually a technology and a finance journalist with New York Times, Bloomberg, and many others. So I got to believe in that role, you were incredible when it came to research and interviewing, probably a much better interviewer than I am.
Oh.
So tell me about that experience and how that experience kind of prepared you for the work that you're doing today.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting lessons that I carried forward from journalism, and maybe not what you'd expect. Journalists are professional explainers, right? And given your speaking and writing experience, I'll bet you know what I mean. Your whole job is to make complex topics clear. And it turns out that that's a very valuable set of skills in tech as well, because tech is full of areas that are highly complex and that very few people understand. So part of my role as a CEO of an AI company is to be a professional explainer, right? To clarify for people how this tech works, what it does, and where it's good for something. So the other great thing about journalism, of course, is just that I met interesting people and I was paid to learn from them all the time. And I feel like that there's something in common there with tech too, because I'm surrounded with very smart people now, PhDs in physics and math, who I'm on my team, who I'm learning from every day as we apply AI to some pretty hard problems in supply chain and industrial operations.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I think makes journalists kind of unique, especially more the investigative, is that they don't necessarily have to be, domain experts, although I think over time they do become. But this notion of quickly being able to become, reasonable subject matter expert based on what they're writing really forces you to develop skill set to cross different domains and be able to pick things up very quickly at a fairly granular level. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple important skills in journalism that also apply here. One is you don't necessarily have to know everything, but you have to know where to look, right? So it's the job of being a good researcher. And secondly, you don't have to know it all, but you have to know how to tell the difference between, say, hype and something real, right? And there's some pretty easy ways to do that, often including the level of granularity at which someone can talk about the problems they're solving.
Yeah, reminds me of Elon Musk and some of the questions that he liked to ask. So I know you eventually ended up working at FutureAdvisor that was acquired by BlackRock for $200 million. And then you went on to find Skymind, as well as now running Pathmind. So tell us a little bit about Pathmind. What is it, and what are you guys looking to address?
So Pathmind applies deep reinforcement learning, which you mentioned, which is a very interesting part of AI right now, to problems in industrial operations. So those could be factory floors. And to supply chains, so routing fleets or working in warehouses. Right? So those two sectors are really where the goods of the world are made and moved, right? And without them, you and I have nothing. So there's a really interesting part of the interest of these problems is helping societies and economies operate better, more efficiently, and more robustly solve problems that we've faced in the last year or so. Right? With COVID, there have been enormous disruptions in supply and demand. And those disruptions have to be solved in a more resilient way, right? Because we all saw the shortages. So bringing AI to those problems is one way to make our systems more resilient.
So I think for the benefit of our audience, if you could be a chief explainer and first give us a baseline of what is reinforcement learning. And I think the problem is AI and machine learning and deep learning, terms like this gets thrown around very, very loosely. But talk about this approach and why is this approach from a technique very useful and applicable for specifically the sectors you guys are targeting.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so machine learning in general is just a family of algorithms that learn from experience. And another word for experience is data. In reinforcement learning, we have a set of those kinds of algorithms that learn how to achieve their goals. So they're doing a very human thing. They learn how to achieve their goals through reinforcement. And anybody who has ever raised a dog knows what reinforcement is, right? You give treats and punishments, right? You reinforce behavior. Now, there are ways to do that numerically with algorithms where you basically tell them you did something right or you did something wrong. And the right and wrong is defined purely by what you want to achieve. So in the situations of industrial operations or logistics, what people want to generally achieve is more efficiency, less cost, greater throughput, right? And all of these things can be defined in numbers. So it's easy to see whether the algorithm did something it should have or not, and to give it feedback, because that's what reinforcement is. It's really feedback. The deep part of deep reinforcement learning is a neural network. So it's tapping into the technological advances people have made in deep learning over the past decade, starting with Jeff Hinton, going with the thread running all the way through DeepMind, that uses these kind of algorithms to solve very hard problems, and bringing it finally to the physical world, the physical plant, where robots operate in factories and warehouses.
Now, just to kind of juxtapose that to other types of techniques that are out there that are completely on its own, where really even the rules of the game are not determined, but yet the systems are able to figure it out and still be able to optimize. Can you talk about those differences and why the approach that you guys are taking still makes most sense?
Yeah, the rules of the game are not determined. That's a great phrase. And I think in life, the rules remain to be defined, right? We're all moving through spaces and situations where we don't entirely know what the rules are. We discover them as we act, right? That's a very human experience. And algorithms are in that experience too. So they're trying to build intuition about the systems through which they move. Those systems are very complex. And part of those systems are other agents, just like part of the environment that we move through is other human beings, right? They are the system that we're interacting with. When you have a ton of agents moving through a system together, it's very hard to predict what they'll do. You get emergent behavior, like the flocks of birds that make shapes in the air. That's emergent behavior, and it happens for robots on factory floors. Strange phenomenon. So that kind of phenomena is a rule in one of these systems, but it's only a rule you can discover when you observe it. So one way to think about reinforcement learning and why it's good is because it allows us to conduct trial and error in extremely complex situations to see what behavior emerges from that. There are other approaches to optimizing these problems. However, it's very hard for them to capture the collective behavior of many machines at once, which means they'll never optimize their collective behavior in a way they need to, just like a coach needs to direct players on a field.
So one of the things that I want to kind of explore is this notion of trade-offs, but also this notion of externality. So, when we think about supply chain logistics as an example, what makes sense from a logistics optimization? If in fact the key indicators, KPIs or OKRs, are more throughputs or lower cost of shipping or faster delivery time, let's say. But in fact, there are variables that may not be taken into consideration, such as decarbonization or use of alternative fuel sources like hydrogen and fuel cell and storage. How does the system take those into considerations, the trade-offs, and then of course, because it's learning from behavior, if it doesn't exist today, is it able to extrapolate in new scenarios that take into account, let's say, hydrogen?
Super interesting questions. So what you're talking about is what we would call a multi-objective problem, where we care about throughput. We also care about the climate, reducing the carbon footprint. Now, it is possible to encode multiple goals into the reward functions. So the way that rewards and penalties are given to these algorithms. It's up to the humans to do that. Right? Obviously, if someone training an algorithm doesn't care about the climate, it will not learn to go green. But if someone who cares about the climate, if a company that is obeying a mandate to reduce its carbon footprint is writing a reward function, then they can somehow measure that footprint. Then they can give rewards and penalties to algorithms that make decisions to support the climate. So you're right. You're in an area of trade-offs, but we can specifically measure those trade-offs. And if you tell us where you'd like to be on that spectrum of trade-offs, we can learn how to get there. Right? Doesn't mean anything's possible, but it means that often we can satisfy several demands at once. The second, Scott, I forgot the second part of your question. What was it?
Okay, that's okay. I think I do have some other questions, which is I think when we think about industrial applications, we're generally thinking about IoT, sensors, digital twin, and I think there's a little bit of confusion in terms of domain, in the sense of some of those things are really more input. Here, what we're talking about is really the analytics behind it. Can you talk about the data sources that you guys are working with, how you guys are transforming, integrating, analyzing it, and then seeing the results? And of course, the things that we're starting to really ask a lot of questions about is data biasness, as well as transparency and explainability of AI.
Yeah. So what I hear you talking about the stages of digital transformation, right? You start out with a blank slate. People don't know what's going on with their operations. They wire it up so they're collecting the right data and moving that through IoT to massive data storage. Right? Could be in the cloud. And a lot of companies are making that as their first step, and it doesn't get them all the way, right? Because they need analytics on top of that. So the next step might be to surface insights, right? Maybe they're using a SQL database, right? Maybe they're using some other form of business intelligence just to tell themselves, to find out what's going on amid all that raw data. But those insights are largely descriptive and retrospective. What just happened? How can I describe it? How can we avoid problems in the future? AI becomes interesting, especially deep reinforcement learning, because it's prescriptive. It is telling you, it is recommending what to do, given the data you have, given the real-time data it may be seeing. Now, you asked, how can we respond to events in the future? Well, the answer is simulations are very useful. So a simulation is a what-if machine. You can make a digital replica of your physical operations, and you can start modifying the parameters to see what would happen if something new came along. And by enlarging those parameters, by increasing the variability of the system to include experiences you've never had in real life, you can teach an algorithm to give robust responses, even in the face of massive disruption, like we've seen this year.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. It's this notion of, you could literally just get lost in those simulation world completely and getting into really kind of anomalies as well as just outlier potential use cases. How does training in those kind of scenario planning properly prepare these algorithms for real life? So going back to the early part of 2020, let's say, with disruption in supply chain and logistics, would some of these companies that were utilizing some of these algorithms that you guys have, would they have been able to prepare, be more agile, or respond?
Yeah, well, you get back to that old distinction between the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, and I find that very useful, actually. So in simulation, for your known unknowns, meaning for example, how much demand will my factory face for certain items, you can bake that variability into the simulation you train on, and you can teach your algorithm to respond to levels of demand that have never historically occurred. So those are the known unknowns. The unknown unknowns might be, what happens if a 100-year flood hits my factory and wipes out half the floor, right? That can be harder to simulate. And when the underlying physics of a model changes, you've got to go back into the simulation, right? And restructure it based on what you learned about the world. So there's some things you can prepare for, and there's some things you can't.
Yeah, very interesting. Can you get into some specific use cases where you guys are adding significant value, just so people have something more tangible to understand?
Absolutely. This kind of machine learning excels as a control tower, coordinating the activity of many machines. So we see large manufacturers starting to put autonomous guided vehicles onto the floors of their factories to move materials around. And those little machines get in each other's way, right? And if each one of them just has an individual incentive to go as fast as it can or take the shortest route, collectively they will not be efficient, right? Where deep reinforcement learning can benefit situations like that is in amassing and centralizing learning and the awareness of all those machines so that they can get out of each other's way, sometimes sacrificing their individual goals to advance the total throughput of the factory. So AGVs in the factories, cranes in a warehouse, same situation. You've got to coordinate the movement of many machines. And that's why I use the analogy of a coach with players on the field, right? Players are working towards a collective goal. They're not all stars, right? Same with these machines. And thirdly, we see some interesting applications simply in price predictions, time series predictions. So factories are confronting enormous fluctuations in the prices of electricity off the grid. Obviously, energy traders are as well. And so in the fluctuation of those prices, right, deep reinforcement learning actually has some power of pattern recognition.
Very interesting. Let's talk about this notion of synergy in the sense of swarms. So swarms of drones, swarms of warehouse robots, or even vehicles for that matter, fleets of vehicles in a smart city context. I think there's kind of a school of thought that the way swarms work is that individually they don't necessarily have to be very smart in terms of the capabilities, but together through contextual understanding, they can work in a collective fashion for the greater good. But again, it's a model that it indicates that it's not necessarily centrally managed, but it's decentrally self-organized. How would that work relative to what you're talking about, which is this notion of almost like an orchestration or abstraction layer on top of these, edge devices and robotics and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it comes down to where intelligence lives, right? And that's primarily a question of bandwidth, right? Because the better bandwidth we have, the more we can centralize that intelligence, and the more we centralize it, assuming constant speeds, the better decisions the group can make. Right? Now, I know decentralization is in vogue these days. I wish I could say that decentralization is the answer here. In fact, we find real advantages to centralization of intelligence in swarms, presuming bandwidth and connectivity. There are many situations, though, where you don't have either of those things, where you need to move, you need to push intelligence out to the edge. And then the main question is no longer bandwidth, but it's the hardware constraints, right? How large of a model can I park in the memory of an edge device, right? And that depends on the device. And how large of a model you want to put there depends on the problems you've trained it to solve.
Very interesting. So taking an example of, let's say, mining. So the issue that you have with mining is going back to connectivity and some of the where does the intelligence reside is above the surface. Certainly, you have access to various forms of connectivity and communication. But as you go deeper into the layers of mining, where you don't necessarily have the ability to penetrate through Earth, and communication may be more localized to a certain deeper level, how do you start to optimize not just at the tiers of the mining operation, but the entire operation when in fact you have these heterogeneous sets of standards, protocols, connectivity, isolation, edge analytics, but yeah, you still want to be able to centrally optimize and manage?
What a great question. And I think that kind of structure that you're talking about, where you have several different kinds of machines that are in fact different, right? They're not all identical machines, learning how to solve several different kinds of problems, not all of them connected at all times, is very similar to problems of autonomous driving, for example. Or maybe you're in the deserts of Utah, right? And you can't talk to the hive mind for a while. Now, there are decisions that can be made locally, and there is learning that can be done asynchronously, meaning maybe if I fall out, if my connectivity is bad because I have to go deep underground, we gotta find a way to store everything that happened, right? So that I can bring it back and learn, basically bring it back to the mothership and learn once I'm connected again, right? So you don't have to give up on those experiences altogether, but the situation you described is one where it would be difficult to learn in real time and update the decisions we make in real time.
Understood. Understood. Now, for those listeners that are thinking, gosh, some of the capabilities that you're talking about can be, provided through the large big techs, right? The IBM Watson and the Bluemix and the Microsoft Azure and the various, AI capabilities there, AWS and some of the machine learning capabilities, and certainly Google. What makes you guys different from some of the big tech and other alternatives that are out there?
Yeah, there's a lot of great technologies out there based on the public clouds, and they're pushing into operational technology, right? So we see a massive, almost secular shift moving these IT technologies from the public clouds into the physical plants. And I would simply say Pathmind's a couple laps ahead of everybody because that's been our sole focus for the past couple of years. Will they catch up with us? Of course they will if we don't keep running fast, right? But those companies are often focused on a broader selection of problems. So our sole focus is how to train reinforcement learning agents to achieve their goals. What you'll see coming out of kind of the smart factory business units of a lot of these public clouds is a focus on computer vision, for example. How do we help machines recognize where they are? What's in front of them? That's a perfectly good problem to solve, but it's only one piece of goal achievement.
Yeah, so you guys are really looking across, like I said, kind of multivariates and looking for those trade-off optimization. Let's talk about a little bit forward-looking in terms of kind of the next 5 years out. How do you foresee this industry that you're in changing, and how does that inform you to enhance your product roadmap?
We are riding a wave of digital transformation. So you'd probably be surprised to know how many companies don't entirely understand the systems that they operate. And by understand, I mean, can they make a sketch deterministically of how they work? It's not always the case. So there's a massive wave of digital transformation coming over these industries where they are learning to formalize that. That digital transformation starts with the data, with wiring it up, data collection and storage. Second stage is analytics. The stage we're at is prescriptive, right? And once you get one prescriptive solution working, then you start to look for others. So yeah, you do have these technologies coming in that are helping companies achieve their goals better, right? Giving them double-digit performance gains. Those solutions will spread across these plants. And I guess you'll see a shift in decision-making, right? From human operators who may be relying on their guts to machines that have learned from the data. And the humans, they're not going to go away, but they will be responsible for the care and feeding of robots that they haven't necessarily needed to care for before.
So as this digital transformation continues, and there's a shift from gut intuition or the Hippo model to that of really relying on data to inform and make decisions, is that, let's say that at some point, based on prescriptive recommendations, company have actually made certain decisions that has certain impact, and then as a result, there's a net negative impact that occurred. How should they address that? And again, I guess I'm really addressing kind of the explainability, right? And the transparency of AI and on the auditability, but also the accountability of AI.
Yeah, this is one of the core problems people are working on in AI, explainability. The first thing I'd like to point out is that humans themselves do not always have complete transparency into why they make decisions. And what I mean by that is we often come up with the reasons why we did something post hoc. Machines are being held to a higher standard, and they should be. However, a lot of the ways that we'll achieve transparency with those machines is not by getting them to explain themselves, but rather simply by watching them act. And so one way to develop intuitions around why AI agents make certain decisions is to watch visualizations of those decisions, especially in simulations, right? So the way our partners and customers are getting to explainability is really, does a human feel like the machine is making the right decisions, right, based on their theory of the system? And the way they get there, that we see, is they watch the machine operate, right? They watch the machine operate, and simulations allow you to put it through many runs to do that. So it's kind of a way of accelerating experience to get to that sense that you think the machine knows what it's doing. As far as auditing goes, of course we can have excellent logs, right? And we can send features into a model to see what it does, right, and replicate a mistake in the past. Perfect explainability for the moment is out of reach, and that's not just for reinforcement learning. That is true for most large parametric models, meaning deep learning in general, right? They're not black boxes. They're what I call gray boxes. Nobody's hiding what they are or what they do, but it's a bunch of numbers that machines can read and humans cannot.
Well, going back to what we talked about at the onset is that you had kind of self-described yourself as a chief explainer, and we cover a lot of kind of novel and maybe more esoteric and technical concepts for listeners, but I think you've done justice in terms of your ability to explain very difficult concepts, so thank you for that. I have been joined by Chris Nicholson, who is the CEO of Pathmind. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.